is happening here. Okay. All right, so religious traditions, good or bad, part 2. Let's move right into it. So we're going to do a little recap. I have here a definition of tradition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and it said it's inherited, established, or customary patterns of thought, action, or behavior, such as a religious practice or a social custom, or a belief or story, or a body of beliefs or stories relating to the past that are commonly accepted as historical, though not verifiable. It goes on further to say it is the handing down of information, beliefs, and customs by word of mouth or by example from one generation to another without written instruction. Cultural continuity in social attitudes, customs, and institutions, or characteristic manner, method, or style. And so this is a definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary as it relates to what traditions are. And we looked on some traditions that we currently practice that we say are good. There are traditions that are quite in order. For instance, like that of standing for our national anthem, that of saluting our flag, and there are Christian traditions that we continue observing, like that of the Lord's Supper, regular church attendance. All these are traditions that are good, and we are going to look on other traditions as the study progresses. And so one of the things we said that if the observance of these traditions become just rituals, they become empty, they become void, when it is only being observed as a tradition without any meaning behind it. And so one of the things we also said is that some traditions can become harmful and also can go contrary to scripture. So sometimes the meaning behind a tradition can become lost over time, but that tradition or that custom continues. Sometimes we find there are traditions where the meaning has changed and it becomes different, even stronger or greater than what it was originally intended to be or what it was originally supposed to imply. So it's important to be able to make these distinctions as to what traditions are healthy, what are harmful. And we looked at the story. I shared the story with you. I don't know if it's true or false, about the woman that was preparing that evening roast, where she had this large piece of roast beef to roast. And what she did was to cut it in two smaller portions, equal portions, and put them in separate pots or trays inside our oven. And the daughter saw her doing it and had asked, why is it do you cut this meat every time you're going to do this kind of a roast? You cut the meat in two, put it in two separate pots and put them in the oven. And the reply of the mother was that she really didn't know why. It was just the way her mother used to do it. So she was just doing or carrying or observing a tradition or a custom that was passed down to her or that she had learned from her mother. So thinking about it, she said, you know something, I'm going to call my mother, which would have been the daughter's grandmother, and find out from her. Finally, she's curious as to why. She just thought it was something to do. But now she's wondering, why is it she really do this? And so when she called her mother, her mother, her mother response was she didn't even know that's the grandmother of the first lady, you know, and she said the only reason she knows she cut it in two was that at that time she didn't have a large enough oven that the entire meat could have fit into properly. And so it was much easier to cut it in two and put it in two separate meats so that they could go in on separate trays inside the oven rather than trying to get, you know, the entire. So that was the only reason, you know. So it was the whole reason was so that it could fit. But now here we find 3 generations after that practice was still being done, but not for the same reason. Because 3 generations down, the granddaughter had no idea. She just thought it was the thing to do. So the granddaughter quite likely had a much larger oven, which the grandmother didn't have in her time when she started doing that. But she just continued because she saw her mother do it and her mother saw her mother do it. And so it was just so the point we were making from that is that at the time when it was first done, it was practical. But by it got to the third generation, it became more a tradition within that family without any actual practical significance behind doing it. And it really serves as a lesson to us that we should be willing to question some of the things that I consider to be ingrained routines and habit that possibly may no longer be relevant. And so so we shared that story last week, and that one of the things I tried to point out that we should not, as people generally speaking, just blindly follow processes and process. You know, there must be space to reevaluate the things that we do to see if the things that we're doing are still relevant and useful, rather than just saying, well, it is the way it used to be done. My grandfather used to do it this way, and my grandmother used to do it that way, without even knowing why it was done then. Probably at that time, it was practical, it was relevant. So we should question, is it relevant now? But we tend to always want to do things the way we have always seen it done. And sometimes the way it was done, sometimes it needs to continue. But there are some things that sometimes it is no longer the most effective and sensible approach to doing some things. And so my encouragement to us is that we stop and we ask the big question, why? Some people don't like when you ask why. They think you're being impertinent and you know, facetious when you say why. You know, some people take offense to people saying why. But why is important? You know, traditions are good because as human beings, we are social creatures, social beings, and it is through shared practices that we come together. Traditions and rituals, these are things that we do together because we are social beings. So traditions, they are like that kind of a social glue that binds us together, that fits us in different areas of society. And also it provides for us, that kind of a family bond. It helps us to have this sense of belonging. So it does play a very important role. But we have to still, in spite of that, we still have to see if what we're doing is healthy, if it is good, or if it is bad. I know sometimes we can view traditions in a negative way, and many times this happens in religious circles. So we said last week that traditions in themselves are neither good or bad, And just because something is repeated or replicated, it doesn't mean, I think we said this last week, it doesn't mean that it isn't of any value, that it isn't important. And in the same way, if something is repeated or replicated, it neither does it mean at all times that this thing is necessary. It doesn't mean that it is valuable either. So just the repetition of something in itself doesn't qualify that thing to be good or bad. And one of the things we want to look on is, well, let me bring this up. We look on the definition of tradition. Oh, there's something else I wanted to bring on screen. All right, we look on the definition of tradition, and we say that it comes from we're talking from the, generally speaking, comes from a Latin word that means to transmit. It means to hand over or to give something over for safekeeping. Like you put up something, you lodge something in the bank for them to keep it, or some institution that can keep something for you. So it is something that is handed over or given up for safekeeping. And so traditions are not necessarily bad, nor are they good. So we'll in due time, we will be able to go through now and learn methods in which we can discern between what are healthy traditions and what are unhealthy or harmful traditions. All right. So we looked at traditions. We said, are they good or bad? And one of the things we said was that traditions in themselves are neither good nor bad. And traditions matter when they relate to important human values. This is where tradition really matter, when it has some connection to human values, things like faith, freedom, integrity, education, personal responsibility, work ethic, selflessness, things like these. So this is what we should use to measure if the thing that we practice is good, bad, if it's worth holding on to. Look on how important it is to values, faith, freedom, integrity, and so on. So I say this is just a recap we're doing here. So we want to move now into a new episode. So we are in part 2, and we are looking at Jesus versus the Jewish law. When I say the Jewish law, no, I'm not talking about the 10 Commandments, but I'm really talking about all these various laws, about 613 laws that were picked out by the different Jewish religious leaders from the first 5 books of the Old Testament, what is called the Pentateuch, or the book of the law. And so we want to start out by reading from the book of Mark, chapter 7. We're just going to read a few verses. It says, "Then came together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is to say, with unwashen hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft or often, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the market, except they wash, they eat not. And many other things there be which they have received to hold, as the washing of cups and pots, brazen vessels, and of tables. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of the elders? I want you to note that the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashen hands. So these are the Pharisees asking Jesus, how is it your disciples are not following the tradition of the elders? And the traditions they are talking about here is to eat with clean hands. But they are saying that your disciples, they are eating bread with unwashen hands. He answered and said unto them, well, had Isaiah, that's Isaiah, prophesied of you, hypocrites, as it is written, this people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain they do worship. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, ye hold the tradition of men. The tradition of men here is the same thing that they were talking about, the tradition of the elders, that they were accusing Jesus of, that his disciples were not observing the tradition of the elders. So Jesus is saying, you guys, you are laying aside the commandments of God, but you hold to the tradition of men as to the washing of pots and cups and many other such like things ye do. So we're going to look at this tradition of men. So let's give you a little bit of background as it relates to the tradition of the elders, as it relates to the book of the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, which is called the Torah or the Pentateuch, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So about 400 years before Jesus was born, the rabbis that were in Jerusalem, they had started to formulate their own laws. And these laws were laws of behavior that they somehow extrapolated from the first 5 books of the Bible called the Torah laws, which is the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So they started to formulate their own laws as it relates to behavior based on their own interpretation of what were written in these first 5 books of the Bible. So the Torah, and you're seeing it on your screen there now, is the first 5 books of the Bible. For those that do biblical studies, we will call those first 5 books the law. Jews would call it the Torah. Another name for it is the Pentateuch. And these first 5 books of the Bible is considered to be the foundational and divinely revealed text that contains the commandments of God. Then we have following that is the Talmud. Now, the Talmud, on the other hand, is really a compilation of biblical discussions by the rabbis, and so they call it rabbinic discussions. So in the Talmud, if you notice how many books, and I still don't have all of them, I just with a couple there. The Talmud really is what you call now the written down or the codified. So if you hear the word codified being used, it means the written down version of the tradition of the elders. So we're going to talk about the tradition of the elders. That the Pharisees were accusing Jesus' disciples that they were not observing the tradition of the elders. So let's go back to what the Talmud is. So we said the Torah is what is the foundational divine revelation or the revealed scriptures that came from God with his commandments to his people. But the Talmud now had not just the Torah, but it also had now a whole bunch of rabbinical interpretations and legal rulings and discussions, and all of these things were based on the Torah. And the Talmud was supposed to serve as some kind of a guide for them to apply the Torah law to their daily life. And so the Talmud was supposed to give that kind of a detailed breakdown based on interpretations and discussions among rabbis. And so before it was written down, it was what you call oral, meaning it was spoken by the religious leaders, and generations after generations would have thus go by memory of what was told to them decades before us. So they took it on themselves to put it in writing, and putting it in writing is what is now known as the Talmud. And so the tradition of the elders is what is contained in the Talmud. Now, you don't have to remember all this, but I kind of needed to give you this little background to kind of help to solidify our understanding of the law and the tradition of the elders that we just read in the book of Mark. And so this is what the tradition of the elders were. It was just a written down version. The Talmud really was a written down version of the tradition of the elders. So what the rabbis did was, based on the laws that were in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, they found within those 5 books, they found 613 commandments, which they call mitzvot. And so the Talmud now has these 613 commandments, plus interpretations, plus discussions, plus legal rulings and guidelines for the people, the Jews, to use for their day-to-day life. Okay? So it was written down, and it was more emphasized by the Pharisees, like what we just read in the book of Mark. It was the Pharisees that were now raising this concern with Jesus, that his disciples were not observing the tradition of the elders, meaning they were not following all these oral traditions that were passed on. At this time, when they were saying it, it was not yet written down or codified, so they had to go by memory. Can you imagine trying to remember 613 commandments, also the various different rules that were added, and interpretations that were added, and the different guides that were added, so as to control how people go about their daily life. And so this is what the tradition of the elders really was. The writing down of it, and creating what we call now the Talmud, was something that came later. So I don't want to go into all of it. You have what is called the Mishnah, you have the Gemara and all that kind of thing. But the Mishnah was the part that contained the 613 laws, the Mishnah, and then the Gemara now was the part that had all the different discussions and the interpretations and the legal all these legal rules and all these kind of things. So the Talmud now was a combination of the Mishnah and the Gemara, these two things coming together. That's why you have so many books. So can you imagine an Orthodox Jew having to study this vast encyclopedia of rules and regulations that affected every facet and aspect of your life? This was what it was like. So the Mishnah, as we said, was really a collection of, you know, the Jewish oral laws, those laws that were spoken into their ears. They go by memory, what's passed down from one generation to another generations. And really is an interpretation of the different of the Torah, which was passed down from generation to generation. But again, we say that the Talmud now was a combination of both the Mishnah and the Gemara, which had now the whole heap of different discussions and commentaries and interpretations and rules and you name it. But we're not going to go into all of that. But I hope that somehow kind of sets for you a foundation and kind of open your understanding to what Jesus was up against. So when these Pharisees were following Jesus everywhere he went, they were accusing him not so much of what was in the Torah, that was clear, but more of what was passed down to them through tradition from the elders, which were a whole bunch of regulations and interpretations and rules and so forth, that they know allowed to become like a stranglehold around them and all the Jews, all the Israelites. And so this was the kind of an environment that Jesus was in, and these were the kind of people that he had to deal with. So these books that we're telling about, the Talmud and which is a combination of the Mishnah and the Gemara, is really man-created oral laws, and these laws were called the tradition of the elders, and then now written down and called the Talmud. So again, in time you hear the Pharisees talking about the tradition of the elders, is talking about these oral laws that were passed down from generation to the generation. If you remember, one of the definitions we give for tradition is something that is passed down, something that is passed on, something that is given over for safekeeping. So this is what it was. So over the centuries, these rabbis, they somehow counted and found 613 individual laws that were in the Pentateuch. And keep in mind that the original purpose of these rabbinical laws was to make sure that it was abundantly clear what was the accepted Jewish Orthodox behavior, what was expected of every Jew, how they ought to behave, how they ought to act in any and all circumstances. So this was what all of this was about, to ensure that every Jew operated in this context, in this kind of a way. So by the time of Jesus, these rabbinic interpretations or extrapolations, they became now a prison. Rather than being something that would set people free, it became now a prison for the Jewish people. And so every aspect of Jewish life was now constrained by this complex network of restrictions and prohibitions. It was like they were in a prison. You understand? So these man-made laws, it would seem like they had more power over the everyday life of the average Jewish person, more than even the biblical law had. One of the things with these tradition of the elders and these things that were passed down is that when it came to carrying a burden or a load on the Sabbath day, that was also restricted. The most basic definition of a burden that could be carried was anything that was heavier than a dried figs. That picture you're looking on is 3 dried figs in the palm of someone's hand. And based on these rabbinical laws in the tradition of the elders, nobody should on the Sabbath day carry anything that is heavier than one of these figs that you see in the picture here. Just imagine it. Just imagine it. On the Sabbath day, you couldn't carry anything that was heavier than one of those fig. You know how much one of those fig weigh? Less than quarter of an ounce. I never say quarter pound, you know. I say quarter of an ounce. 16 ounces make a pound. And one of these fig weighed less than quarter of an ounce. So if you were to carry 3 figs, you would have broken the Sabbath if you were to walk with 3 figs in your hand on the Sabbath day. This is how rigid these laws were. These regulations were really designed to prevent any kind of activity that could be considered work. But what happened is that this excessive nature is the very reason why Jesus talked about even figs in one of the parables. So just keep in mind the size of these figs and just imagine what the dried figs, less than quarter of an ounce. That's what these figs weigh. But you know, Jesus have always been trying to point out to the Pharisees and to those around him that was hearing him that the Sabbath was made for people, and not the other way around. It was made to benefit, not to become a burden. If you remember Jesus healing that man that was at the pool of Bethesda, I think I have that picture on a slide here. Here we find Jesus healing this man that was lying down at the pool of Bethesda. But he was so crippled he couldn't even pull himself to go into that pool. Remember, it was believed that an angel, it was one of those what's the term they use now? Anyhow, but he didn't have the strength to pull himself into that pool because around that pool were a whole lot of other sick people. And they knew that a certain time of the year, the water would be troubled by an angel. So the scripture called it an angel. Whether it was an angel of God or whatever, but it just said an angel. And so he was in this place where a lot of people also were. But there were people that were those sick were more able-bodied than him, that was able to get into that pool before him. And so he was at this pool for how long? I think what, 38 years? I think it was 38 years. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I think it was 38 years. And after Jesus healed this man that was lying at the pool of Bethesda, he told this man that he should go and get up and that he should pick up his bed and walk. No, the bed was not like your ceiling mattress bed and, you know, I don't know what other one and have, you know, these brand name beds. It wasn't a mattress upon a divan base or with fancy carved headboard or whatever. Their bed was just a mat, just a small piece of rug. So when Jesus said, pick up your bed, it was really saying, pick up your mat. and walk. And so when Jesus told him that, the man took up his mat, and the Jews saw him, that this man that was healed, and rather than seeing that this was a miracle that happened when Jesus healed this man, they were more concerned, rather than give God the glory that, whoa, they know this man to have been in this position for almost 40 years, 38 years he has been in this position. I think it's 38, correct me if I'm wrong, 38 years, right? And rather than giving God the glory, they were more concerned with the fact that this man was healed on the Sabbath day. Also, the fact that he was carrying his mat on the Sabbath day. And of course, that mat, when him roll it up, would have been heavier than the dry fig. Remember I showed you the dry fig? So just think about it. This was where it was at. You could not carry anything heavier than a fig, a dried fig, not even a fig was just pick, one might have a little bit more weight. Probably might weigh, probably an ounce, but a quarter of an ounce. And not even that. You couldn't carry something heavier than that. So when this man was both healed on the Sabbath and was carrying his mat on the Sabbath, this was all the Pharisees could see. They could not see the miracle that took place in this man's life. Sometimes we can be so consumed and, absorbed in our traditions and the things that we're accustomed to see, the things that we use to identify each other as Christians, that even if someone comes among us that is genuinely saved, converted, and miraculously touched by God, because we are only looking on some external things that we have been handed to us to determine persons' state of being as far as salvation is concerned, that we don't even try to hear what we don't even listen to the testimony of these persons, because in our mind, such a person could not be saved because they look different than us, because they talk different than us, because they do something a little bit different than us. Why? Because sometimes our traditions blinds us and doesn't allow us to see what God is doing. And so we see that. Let's look at a few more things that was forbidden. There's a whole lot. I say we talk about 613 laws, and then those different laws were now extrapolated into further rules, into minute details. I mean, we could go on and go on and go on for weeks upon weeks, just going through each of these minute details that the Jews had to follow based on the traditions of the elders. Another thing they could not do on the Sabbath day, they could not touch grain on the Sabbath day. They could not remove. You see, as you see that that person's hand filled with barley grain. If they were ever caught rubbing those grain to get the husk off them, they would be guilty of harvesting based on the tradition of the elders. If they try to rub them in their finger, they would be guilty of threshing, which was a method they used to separate, the wheat from the other stuff that was not needed. They could not clean the bruised ears of grain, as they would be guilty of sifting. And they couldn't rub them in them hand and throw them up and try to blow out the shaft. If they try to do that, rub, like him have that hand there and rub it between him hand and blow the shaft out, he would be guilty of winnowing, winnowing was a thing. Let me see, I think I have a picture here. This was what winnowing is. This is when they have harvested barley and grain, then they have these pitchforks that they use now, and they use the pitchforks and throw the grain up in the air. And they would do it when it is windy, and the wind would now blow the chaff away and only the grain would drop back to the ground, because the grain would have been heavier than the chaff. So they would, use that and throw the chaff, throw the grain up in the air, and then the wind would just blow the lighter chaff away and the grain would fall. And they just keep doing that until they now have. And so that was winnowing. But if you on the Sabbath day just get a few grains of barley or whatever in your hand, and you rub it and you throw it up, and you would have been guilty of winnowing. And this is how rigid the traditions of the elders were, these laws. So when I say Jesus versus the Jewish laws, I'm not talking about the Decalogue. I'm not talking about the Ten Commandments. I'm talking about these hundreds of laws that were further complicated with a lot of different interpretations, creating large manuscripts that they had to follow. And so the life of the Jew based on these laws was very difficult. So here again, we find that Jesus was going through the grain field. Let's read from Luke chapter 6. And it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked the ears of corn and did eat, rubbing them in their hands. Same thing I was telling you about. And certain of the Pharisees said unto them, why do ye that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day? And Jesus answering them said, have ye not read so much as this, what David did when himself was a hungered, and they which were with him, how he went into the house of God and did take and eat the shewbread, and gave also to them that were with him, which it is not lawful to eat but for the priests alone? And he said unto them, that the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. So just to rub those grain of corn in their hands was a problem. It was for them breaking the law. So even though they were hungry, and this is what the Bible says, they were hungry. All right. So, when I think about this, every time Jesus had to confront these Pharisees, and it looked like these Pharisees were constantly following him. As a matter of fact, I was looking at something, it was either yesterday or today. I'm going to get the details on it. But they were so bent on trapping Jesus that the distance they traveled, these Pharisees, from one city to a particular city was like over 100 miles. Just to trap him. They followed the disciples, and they were, just trying to find a reason to trap him. Another thing is that you couldn't walk over a certain amount of miles, or a certain amount of cubits, I should say, cubits, on the Sabbath day. If you walk more than 2,000 cubits on the Sabbath day from your home, if you left your home and you were walking, 2,000 cubits is about half a mile. So let's work out half a mile. So if you were to leave your house to go to a synagogue, and your journey was more than 2,000 cubits, or more than a half a mile, on the Sabbath day, you would have violated these rabbinical laws. You would have violated the tradition of the elders. So what some of the Jews did to wriggle them way out of this, and for them to continue the journey, when they know that the journey is going to exceed a half a mile, what some of them did was walk backwards. So once they realized that they were getting close to a half a mile, so as not for it not to be seen that they broke the Sabbath by walking a half a mile. Them turn around and start walk backwards to wherever they were going. Just imagine the kind of a life, how miserable that must have been. Another thing was that women were not allowed to look at themselves in a mirror. Sorry, this is the only picture I could find at the time. So they could not look at themselves in a mirror on the Sabbath, because it is said that if them look in a mirror on the Sabbath, they might just find a gray hair or white hair, and they might attempt to pull it out. And if they pull out that white hair or that gray hair, that would have been sin, because it would have been considered work. Just think about it. If a person had a problem with their ears, they had an earache, and they got somebody to dip something like cotton in oil and put in the ear, because they have different oils they can use to help with ear problem. If the person was to get that piece of cotton or wadding, whatever it is, and dip it in oil and put it in the ear on the Sabbath day, and that piece of cotton was to fall out of your ears, you could not bend down to pick it up, because that would be the sin of work. And then, of course, you had also the sin of being healed on the Sabbath day, because that also was considered to be a sin. No healing should take place on the Sabbath day. And this is how rigid the tradition of the elders were. So when they confronted Jesus in the book of Mark, as we read earlier, about his disciples not washing their hands before eating, it is coming not from the biblical laws, but rather from these traditional laws, the tradition of the elders, which later became known now as the Talmud. So healing was not allowed. Healing was work, and it was not permitted on the Sabbath day. Was not permitted on the Sabbath day. If you remember, there was a woman that was, call it crippled. She was bowed down. Let's find that scripture. All right, here it is. So in Luke chapter 13, verses 10 to 17, it says, and he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bowed together, and could in no wise lift up herself. I remember I see somebody on Malines Road in Kingston, and that person, yes, he's an elderly person. Not sure if it's a man or a woman. I'm still trying to make out the features, but I think he's a man. But that person was so bowed. He was bent like at a right angle. I don't know if you can see it. His back was bent like that, you know. I mean, he was bent over, his face was facing the ground. That's how he could not stand up straight. And I think this is what the situation with this woman was. The Bible says, and she was bowed together and could in no wise lift up herself, just like that man I saw. And when Jesus saw her, he called her to him and said unto her, woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. And the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation. Now, 18 years this woman stayed this way now. 18 years. That means them see her, because there's no way you can see somebody look like that and you don't remember. Just like how I remember that man I see on Malines Road all the time. I can't forget. Because it's not normal to see somebody looking like that. And this woman was now healed. And the ruler of the synagogue answered with what? Indignation, because that Jesus healed on the Sabbath day, and said unto the people, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them, therefore, come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. So his concern was healing on the Sabbath, not about the healing that the woman received after 18 years of suffering. Remember, Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath was created to be a blessing and not a burden. But they turned it around and they created their own interpretations of what is considered work. Like what I said, somebody with an ear infection, and you put a piece of cotton with some healing oil, whether it be tea tree oil or peppermint oil or lavender oil or whatever it is in your ear, and that piece of cotton drop out, you couldn't bend down to pick it up, even though it was helping to relieve you of your discomfort, to relieve you of your pain. If you bend down and pick it up, it would be breaking the Sabbath. And so your healing and your health benefit is not so important. And this is where they took it. They created these minute details and restrictions and prohibitions in the law. And Jesus answered him and said, "Thou hypocrite, doth not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or his ass from the stall and lead him away to watering? And ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan had bound, lo, these 18 years, be loose from this bond on the Sabbath day?" And when he had said these things, all his adversaries were ashamed, and all the people rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. What a situation! What a condition Jesus had to be in. The people he had to deal with, these religious leaders that were blinded by their traditions and could not see beyond, see what God was doing, because this is how we do things. They don't understand the benefits of the Sabbath, what it was created for. And so they created all these different rules. As I said, if we were to go into all of the different rules that exist in the Talmud, in the tradition of the elders, man, it would take us probably weeks to complete, because the list just goes on and on and on and on. And so this was what Jesus was up against. So when you say Jesus versus the Jewish law, it was Jesus versus these laws, these traditions, these things that became a prison, that became a burden to his people. Let's move on. So the thing about it is that Jesus was quite outraged against these Pharisees and these scribes. And in Matthew chapter 23, I don't, verses 13 to 33, I couldn't write the entire chapter, put the entire chapter on the slide. So I just picked out just specific parts of the verses in Matthew 23, verses 13 to 33. So I didn't write out the entire verses, just parts of it. Listen to what he kept saying from verse 13, 20 verses. Here's what he kept saying: "Woe to you, teachers of the law, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! Woe to you, blind guides! Woe to you, you blind guides! You strain at a gnat, but swallow a camel. Woe to you, teachers of the law, Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and self-indulgence. Woe to you, you are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead bones and everything unclean. Woe to you, you snakes, you brood of vipers, serpents." So a lot of woes. How much woe is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 woes in just 20 verses. 7 woes to religious hypocrites who made life more difficult for the people that God wanted to ease their burdens. Yes, come unto me, all ye that are heavy laden, and I'm going to give you rest. God wants to give people rest, but these religious hypocrites were placing burdens on them that they themselves couldn't even bear. And Jesus spoke about this. Jesus is calling people unto him. He said, take my yoke on you and learn of me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus is not handing to us a life that is harder and more burdensome. No. But these Pharisees were putting on the people burdens, loads that they themselves could not even carry, could not even bear. And so they had to put on a show, and they had to keep up appearances. And so they did so by keeping long prayers, public prayers, meeting in the marketplaces, by wearing long robes and gowns, and letting them face, let their face look, pious, and, and sound pious. Because they had to keep up appearances. But inside they were full of dead man's bones. They were, as Jesus said in one of the verses here in this chapter 23 of Matthew, that they were like whitewashed sepulchres or whitewashed tombs. They look pretty on the outside, because these graves in Israel were kept. Most of them were immaculately kept, and they were painted regularly, maintained. And so from a distance, the graveyards look quite nice, white and pretty. And I said, you are like these whitewashed sepulchres, these whitewashed tombs, look beautiful. Everybody look on and say, "Wow, what a nice edifice! What a nice church! What a nice Christian! Oh, she looks so nice, so well put together. Oh, she wears white, so she looks righteous." You know. But on the inside, Jesus said they were full of dead men's bone and everything that was unclean, meaning some were already dried and some were in a decaying process, because in the cemetery there are graves that were there long decades and centuries, and there were new graves that had corpses that were in there that were in a state of decomposition. So no matter how beautiful these tombs look, inside was corruption. Inside was distasteful. And this was how he described these Pharisees. It wasn't all the Pharisees were like that, but for the most part, they were. Sandra Sweeney Silver, she said this. She said it cannot be overemphasized how Jesus' continual breaking of fictitious rabbinical laws in the Halalka brought him not only into conflict with the religious establishment, but led eventually to his death on the cross. Now, the Halalka is the same thing we call the Gerera, which is that part of the Talmud, or the traditions of the elders, that had these additional interpretations, minute details into interpretations as to how they were to keep the Sabbath and what they shouldn't do and all that kind of thing, and so it was the Alalka. So he said that it cannot be overemphasized how Jesus' continual breaking of the laws in the Halalka brought him not only into conflict with the religious establishment, talking about the scribes and the Pharisees, but is what led eventually to his death on the cross. So it was his continual breaking of these tradition of the elders, because he did not follow these traditions, at least in some cases, and they used that against him. And so he was in constant conflict with these Pharisees and these scribes, and it is what eventually led to his death on the cross. So this is by Sandra Sweeney Silver. Now, traditions can become standards, and many times they do. Traditions become standards when they are widely adopted, when they are deeply ingrained, and they are no longer questioned. So traditions, when they're out there and has been adopted, and generation after generation adopts these traditions, these practices, these customs, these traditions sometimes can become deeply ingrained. So whether they be health traditions or harmful traditions over time, because it has been adopted generation after generation, it being passed down orally, can become ingrained. And when folks no longer question them, right, these traditions now become expected or mandated by whatever the organization is, or by whatever the institution is. So when they are left unquestioned, after a while it becomes mandated. And this is how now traditions become standards. And this kind of a transition from a tradition to a standard, often this transition is going to take place over several generations. And it happens as it relates to cultural values, as it relates to norms that are passed down. And many times those traditions often become now a rigid standard when it is seen as the rule to be followed, rather than it being a flexible practice. So before it was a practice, it was a custom that was, being passed down. But then because it is no longer questioned, it becomes mandated. And over generations, there are values and norms that are passed down along with these traditions. And then over time, they become this kind of a rigid standard. And it is now a rule that must be followed, rather than it being, was it was originally something that was a flexible practice. So for traditions to remain relevant, they have to evolve. They have to evolve with time. They have to evolve with the changes that are taking place with times. There are changes that are taking place even in some of the values. And so if traditions are to remain relevant, there has to be some evolving that must take place with some traditions. If not, they can become harmful, some can become restrictive, and some can become an obstacle to progress. And so we find that harmful traditions often manifest as outdated rules that are many times no longer relevant or applicable. And sometimes they stifle, some can stifle personal spiritual growth. They can cause, spiritual, sometimes emotional, sometimes even physical harm to members within that religious setting, that church setting. So there are some traditions that are harmful. I find that some of these traditions that may not be easily adopted by some new persons that may come into the group, that those persons sometimes are treated differently. They are treated with indifference, sometimes with scorn, because they don't fit. Not because there is anything intrinsically wrong with that person, but because they don't adhere, or they are taking too long to adhere to what is the given standard in this group, that they are not treated. And so opportunities sometimes are missed by these persons to be involved in ministry, to be involved in, areas where they can be, beneficial, because of these harmful traditions. And I said traditions can be good and they can be bad, depending on how we allow it to manifest amongst us. If we don't allow some of these traditions to be flexible, and they are just rigid, then they can become rules that stifle growth, that cause emotional harm, emotional pain to other members. There are folks that will come into some of our church circles that, based on where they're coming from, may not quickly adapt to some of the quote unquote standards that we have. And they have great difficulty understanding why is it they cannot do some things. And so some may submit and surrender to the tradition because they want to remain a part of the group, but inwardly they are not convicted about that. So what we have only been succeeded in being successful in doing is just getting people in the group, but inwardly they may not be convicted about that. And given the opportunity, they will break away, if necessary, from that group or from that tradition. And so nothing would have really been won apart from that momentary uniformity that was created by them looking and sounding and acting like me, or acting like the rest of the group. And so traditions can become standards, and they often become standards. And standards are good. Standards are good. But there has to be flexibility in many of our what we call standards. Because if there's no flexibility, we can end up become like the Pharisees, where we miss the heart of God by judging persons based on they not fitting the look. They're not fitting the part that we are accustomed to, that we have been taught, that have been passed down to us. We not even understanding the history and the background of why we do some things. Some of the things that we currently do as church folks, we can't even find scriptures to back these things. And if we do, those scriptures are taken out of context. This is not to say there should be no rules and regulations. There has to be rules. There has to be regulations. Every church needs to have standards and rules and regulation and guidelines. But we have to be careful of the rigidity, how rigid these become. And we have to, as we implement and we We teach these things that we do so in a spirit of love and also with patience, understanding that there are those that may not see that way. And as I said, many of the times we cannot defend some of the things that we hold dear to as standard. And we kind of sometimes get on take this stance where, well, this is how it is done, and this is how we have always done it. That still doesn't answer the question that this person might ask, but where in scripture does it say it have to be done this way? And some people say, let's learn to follow instructions, and so we find sometimes even in our churches there is not space for people to ask questions, not space for people to be open and express how they feel about things. You're going to fall, and the sad thing about it is that many times when people like myself might say this, the argument is brought up that then we need to go to court, and the judge say you can't come inside here looking a certain way, or you at the job and the job say you're expected to wear this uniform and that uniform and so forth. Oh, you want to come to church and you want to just come anyway and you want to wear it. You understand? That I understand, but we cannot use the standards of the world to govern the church. We cannot use the standards of the world to govern the church. And so we have to be so mindful. The Bible always should be our standard that we go by, that guides us. And yes, every church, every pastor has the responsibility to put in place rules and stuff that can regulate conduct. But at the end of the day, as I said last week, it is God that worketh in us, both to will and to do of his good pleasure. And we cannot play the role of God. We can set guidelines, we can help to guide, but we cannot play God with people. And so we have to be so careful lest we, like the Pharisees, miss important moments, miss when God is doing a work. Just like they could not see the miracles that was happening to the woman that was bowed in her infirmity for 18 years. They could not see the miracle that was done in that man that was lame, paralyzed for 38 years, sitting at the pool, 38 years of his life, almost what, 40 or 20, whatever, 20 years of his life just gone like that. And all they could see was that he was breaking a tradition. Breaking a tradition. All they could see for the woman is that she was breaking a tradition, or Jesus broke a tradition. They could not even glorify God for the great deliverance that was wrought for this woman. So traditions become standard through several ways. One, through general transmission. Let me see, what time is it? Whoa, all right. All right, I want to wrap up after this slide. This is the last slide I'm giving you for tonight. So traditions become standards through one, generational transmission. What we mean by that is when a practice, when a belief or a object typically is transmitted at least 2 or 3 generations, that is normally considered traditional. And so it is generational transmission, passing down a practice, passing down a belief from one generation to another. So over time, these widely shared customs, they become accepted without question. And so it is what my father used to do. It is what his father used to do, and his father used to do. And so it becomes now accepted, no questions about it. So generational transmission, that's one way that traditions become standard. Another way is through adaptation and acceptance. And what we mean by that is that traditions can adapt to suit certain societal needs, especially when there are changes happening within society. If these adaptations are significant, they can be accepted as part of the ancient, we like to talk about ancient way and the ancient tradition. Even though we were not around during the time of the apostles, we still sometimes think we know what the ancient way was. And as we go on, we're going to look on some things that were ancient, but we cannot practice now. We cannot use now, you know. So tradition can become standards through generational transmission. It can become standards through adaptation, people adapting certain things just to suit something that is changing societally, or it can be, becoming a standard through acceptance. We accept this as something that is an ancient custom, you know. So yeah, that is one way. Another way is through deep-seated belief. When traditions are connected to what we call core human values, like for instance, like faith, like integrity. When traditions are connected to like selflessness, these things can have significant meaning, and they can become important standards by which we live, by which we understand life. So deep-seated beliefs normally is centered around our faith, it is centered around our selflessness, around our integrity, things like that. Another way that tradition becomes standard is how we react to things that are modern. So traditions can be revived to serve as a kind of a defense against what is possibly perceived as a destabilizing influence of modern things. When person think that, boy, too much modern thing are coming out of the church, they try to revive an old way to protect what might be perceived. No, I say perceived because it's not happening, but it is perceived that this new thing coming in is destabilizing what we are accustomed to. And so there's a revival. For instance, we might see persons now going to the podium with tablets to preach, and persons now start fold them hands now and boy, I don't know what the church are come to, all them come with a tablet nowadays and phone, and and the Bible is the Holy Bible, that no holy, yeah, and things like that. And so we some people are turned off because they perceive that these devices, which are modern, is somehow having a destabilizing influence on how things used to be. So what happened now? There's a reaction to these modern things in order to create some defense. And so to create the defense now, there is a rehearsing of how things used to be, and the holding up of your Bible, the printed Bible, that we have. This is the word of God, and this is, but if we understood that the Bible that we have was not, the original manuscript was never on paper. It was never on paper. The original scriptures were written on various materials. Like the Old Testament was written most likely on papyrus, and some of it was written on animal skin. How much of us are going to try and find the original papyrus? which is the pulp that was taken from certain plants and pressed down and dried, and then that was written on. How many people would be willing to carry animal skin into a church and read from animal skin what God's word? So, you know, when we take up what we have now as printed, and we think that because it's printed on paper, that is what makes it holy. We're so wrong, because the original text was not on paper. It was on papyrus. It was on animal skin, right? The New Testament manuscripts were most of it was found written on papyrus, and eventually some of it was rewritten on parchment and then was rolled into scrolls. There were other materials that some of the scriptures that we have today were written on things like tablets, not your iPad now. You know, when we say tablets now, we're talking about stones, flat stones. Yeah. Some were written on wooden tablets. Yes, these were some of the things that were used to write scriptures on. So there is not any single material that was used for the original scripture. The type of writing material that was used for the scriptures varied over time and place. And so I want us to keep that in mind, that these are some of the things that can cause tradition to become standards: generational transmission, what adaptation and acceptance, deep-seated belief, and even reaction to what is modern, to modern things. In reacting, there's a resistance that is put up and a defense, and trying to do a reaffirmation and a rehearsing of the old ways and how we used to do it, not bearing in mind that that was something that was passed down to us from generations before. And so I'm going to stop right here. I think we have gone quite over my time, 15 minutes over my time. And then we can pick up next week when we look and when traditions become harmful standards. So I'm going to stop right here. I want to thank you for your patience, for your attentiveness. Those that have joined on Facebook and YouTube, I want to thank you for stopping by and being a part of this study. I'm not too sure if, let me see.